Hello, my name is Ash Sarkar, and welcome to this talk hosted in the virtual LRB bookshop, which is less a bookshop at the moment and more of a state of mind that you can't escape. It's like Inception, where you're not really sure if you ever made it out of the dream. Anyway, I am very excited to introduce Owen Hatherley, who tonight will be talking to us about his new book, Red Metropolis, Socialism and the Government of London. Owen, for those who wish to be reminded of his CV, is culture editor at Tribune. He's got a book output, which means that legally you are allowed to describe him as a prolific author. I've always wondered what the line is for that, but rest assured, Owen is well over it. And because this is an online event, I don't have to deal with the social consequences of being super duper cringe. I don't have to deal with that in person. So it's kind of safe for me to confess that Owen's writing on architecture and political and social history was super influential for me personally. And I remember reading A New Kind of Bleak when I was at uni and immediately decided that my next piece of coursework had to be about the impact of regeneration on representation of London council housing in film. And my tutor read the coursework and was like, I see you've been reading Owen Hatherley. Just busted. So yeah, I stan Owen. I stan Owen with the kind of tenacity usually reserved for Korean boy bands. So Owen, thank you for dropping the restraining order and joining us all tonight.
I couldn't be more flattered.
He actually paid me to say all this stuff. So just a bit of housekeeping. How tonight is going to go is that first I'm going to ask Owen some questions. And while I do that, you lot in the audience should be filling up the event chat with your cues that you would like some A's to. So just keep putting questions in there. They could be offensive, prurient, uncomfortably personal, but ideally about the book and its themes. So I will try and leave as much time for questions as I possibly can. The event will last all in all about an hour. I was definitely joking about the uncomfortably personal questions. I don't know, unless they're really good, maybe I'll answer one of them. Or Owen will answer one of them. Okay, so I guess we should kick off with talking about the book, Red Metropolis. And I guess I should say that, look, I'm not an unbiased interlocutor because the way I feel about London is the way I feel about my family, which is I can slag it off. And if anyone else slags off London, I'm just ready to throw punches. So really my first question for you, Owen, is about there is this tendency in left-wing circles to extrapolate from the entrenched regional inequalities in this country, a very binary moral positioning of London is elitist and it's decadent, and fundamentally it is devoid of working class authenticity. And the North is like the heartland of all socialist consciousness ever. And so I was kind of wondering when I was reading this book, is it in some way a rebuke to that tendency amongst the left?
Yes. I suppose there's all sorts of things that kind of got to me about that. I think sort of historically it's sort of weird and dubious. This is kind of, how do you explain this when it's kind of it's the capital city and that's where all the wealth is, and so therefore it must be right-wing and reactionary. And I sort of think, have you heard of a thing called the Paris Commune? But sort of as well as that, it's just historically not true. So as well as a kind of irritation at the fact that the most kind of reliably left voting part of the country in the last few years is considered to be this kind of outpost of sort of the metropolitan elite. Also, just in terms of British history for the last 150 years, it's just not true. I'm sat here in the London Borough of Southwark in a parliamentary seat which last voted Tory in 1931. Most of inner London could tell exactly the same story. Most of places that weren't part of the old LCC, like West Ham and Tottenham, can tell exactly the same story. These places haven't been Tory really since universal suffrage was brought in. So the kind of idea that that there's this kind of monolithic block called the North, which usually seems to include the Midlands, which is puzzling. And then there's this kind of, that Labour doing very well in London is something that needs to be explained rather than something that always happens and is as obvious as Labour doing very well in, say, Liverpool or Newcastle. Probably much more obvious historically than Liverpool, but that's another story altogether. So there was a kind of historical irritation, but also just an irritation at the way that certain events in the last 5 years have just had no real influence on the way that British politics and British social life is discussed. One of these that's obviously the most obvious is Grenfell. That there was, I remember a few days after the 2017 election, there was, this kind of like, Kensington went Labour, so therefore this is the metropolitan elite. And then a few days later, 72 people die in a fire in a tower block in Kensington, in North Kensington. And presumably this is this is the kind of, the metropolitan elite that were immolated. And I kind of thought when that happened, this huge kind of Hillsborough-like disaster is going to stop people reproducing these stereotypes about Londoners, that they're all kind of minted and all sit on property wealth and what have you. And it didn't. It made absolutely no difference. And in fact, the 2019 election means that they're coming back even more, and we have to put up with even more of this crap. So yes is the answer to that question.
I mean, I do want to talk specifically about Grenfell because the inquiry is still ongoing. And what's coming out of it is that people did know that the cladding was flammable. Key documentation is just very conveniently going missing, or the files were accidentally deleted or whatever. And still with all of this going on, Kensington is still synonymous within the popular imagination as like very chichi, very like bourgeois. It's kind of aristocratic. There are the international elites. Even though scores of working class people died fundamentally because nobody was willing to listen when they said that the place where they lived was unsafe. And in the book, one of the things that you point out is that this is totally inseparable from questions of local governance.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Kensington and Chelsea are a spectacular example of this, and that at the same time that they were forcing the price of the renovation of that tower down as low as possible, they were also handing out a council tax rebate to their residents. And in the south of the borough, and in parts of the north of the borough as well, that includes some of the richest people on earth. And they were being given council tax rebates at the same time. They were there's no way we could possibly, afford this extra bit of money so that this thing isn't clad in napalm. So it was just, these are sort of seen as separate phenomena. And I think the problem, that's the main problem, is that they're not separate. They're completely the same thing. And the fact that London does play home to a large proportion of the super rich is one of the reasons why I think life is kind of particularly precarious and particularly dangerous for working class people in London.
Well, it's easier to mistreat working class people when you say the place where they live is full of elites anyway, and those elites don't know nothing about nothing. And if they make any claim to working class proximity, it's the wrong kind. It's the brown, stabby kind rather than the whip it and flat cap kind.
Yeah, absolutely. And this has been going on for a while. I mean, one of the things I don't mention in the book was a whole debate about the East End that was going on about 12 years ago, with various kind of sociologists attached to various think tanks kind of going, it's not what it used to be. Counter housing goes to brown people now. This betrays the settlement after the Second World War, where, counter housing would only be given to you if you'd had a leg blown off or whatever the hell. And it was just, there was a sort of element of truth in this about the way that people kind of received the welfare state and the way that they perceived it. But piled on that is just an enormous quantity of nonsense.
But I mean, I think we're talking about the way in which politics is fought on a cultural terrain. That cultural terrain is a reflection of a material one, but not reducible to it. And I would say one of the really important things to bear in mind is the power of negative solidarity. So it's a kind of emotional impulse of, I'm not going to vote for things to be better for everyone because everyone includes people who I deem to be undeserving.
Yeah, of course. And that's, a lot of the coalition that the Tories have successfully assembled comes from that particular impulse, and comes from giving people a small thing that they can then be terrified that they might lose. And that's where the kind of the importance of home ownership, I think, comes into all of it. At the lowest levels of home ownership in the country by far are in inner London. And actually some of the highest are in the so-called Red Wall, which didn't exist until last December. So I think it's hard not to see that as part of what's going on. But, what would I know? I live in London.
You're a effete metropolitan elite. I'm sorry, me and you both.
I'm certainly effete, but...
I mean, in the book, there are just so many bits of London history that I had no idea about. One of the things that just leapt out to me was this account of, I think 30 Labour councillors in Poplar doing jail time because they wanted to fund quite an ambitious welfare programme by cutting their payments to the London County Council. And I didn't know this, that the slogan, better to break the law than break the poor, came from. And that was obviously used in the 1980s, with the militant-run council in Liverpool. And so my question to you is, why hasn't this radical history of London been a big part of how its identity is perceived? Because Liverpool, no one can impugn Liverpool's socialist credentials,
Which is funny because, without wanting to be rude to Liverpool, because I think Liverpool is a wonderful city with a wonderful political history, Liverpool didn't become a Labour stronghold until the 1980s. In fact, Militant made Liverpool a Labour stronghold. Whereas inner London, zones 1 to 3 London, apart from, Belgravia and whatnot, has been a Labour stronghold for 100 years, almost uninterrupted. So, might raise an eyebrow at that. But I think some of these things are remembered. Like there is the mural of the Poplar councillors somewhere down a back alley in Bow, as I remember. There are things like the mini Lansbury clock. There are kind of, the memories of Cable Street and so on. There are these kind of little things that are remembered, but I think this is actually one of those things of just the vastness of London. It's very different. It's very difficult to kind of come out of a kind of unitary history for a city of 9 million people that's about the size of Belgium. It's not really. It's inherently tricky. But I think those histories are actually fairly known in particular areas. But there's a sort of vested interest, I think, in sort of downplaying them in favour of others. And I think actually this is a thing which the left is part of a little bit. Like people on the left kind of love, talking about the kind of great defeats, let's say.
Yeah.
Like, Chartism or the Gordon riots or what have you, and these kind of moments of like sort of failed insurrections, of which London has a few. But actually, to a large degree, the story of municipal socialism in London is a story of success, of electoral success and social success. It did what it set out to do to a large degree, and that's why it was abolished in 1986. Literally had to be legislated out of existence. So. Yeah, and I think that's part of it as well. I think the kind of absence of that of the GLC is one of the reasons why that's not so well understood. I think the creation of the mayoralty has never filled that gap.
I mean, maybe we should go, sort of back to the start and, could you tell us a bit about the LCC? Because in your words, it's an experiment in socialism from the very start. And in terms of my knowledge of London history, that was brand new information. But then again, anything before 2005 is brand new information for me. But yeah, if you could talk us through it.
Sure. So it's really odd to me that there's not more known about it, because there are, as far as I could tell, there are 2 proper books on the LCC. Like one is a book from 1995 about the first 15 years of it, and the other is an anthology from the mid-80s, and that's a lot. Whereas if you want to research something like the Great Dock Strike or even Poplar, there'll be dozens and dozens of things. And again, I think this is because they won, because it was successful, and the memory of success has to be repressed at all times. So the LCC was set up by an Act of Parliament in 1889 and encompassed more or less all of London up to that point, except for a big chunk of the East End. Particularly around West Ham, Stratford, and so on, which was very built up at that time, but wasn't in it I think largely so that they could continue polluting it, as the LCC had quite strict rules on pollution that I think various business interests were quite worried about. So it was supposed to be kind of non-partisan initially, and this was basically nonsense from the start. So it ended up being fought out between two political forces which kind of stood in for the Liberals and the Tories, but not quite. So you had the Progressives on the one hand, who ran the council from 1889, from the first elections until 1907, and they were basically made up of the kind of left wing of the Liberal Party and the kind of nascent socialist movement. The people that had come from the Social Democratic Federation were kind of vaguely Marxist. The Independent Labour Party.
Don't knock vague Marxism. Some of us have made very good careers out of vague Marxism.
Just because I sort of imagine there's a kind of like a real Marxist, at the Historical Materialism Conference, is going to suddenly appear and go, I think you'll find that none of these people have read the Grundrisse. Anyway. But so those people were sort of around. Trade unionists and Marxists, and also the Fabian Society were very much part of it, with all of the kind of interesting and dubious things that the Fabians got up to. So then you had the kind of opposition to that, who initially didn't do terribly well, the Ratepayers Party, or the Municipal Reformers, as they were variously called, whose entire platform was like, we don't want to spend money on anything. Which
so
initially,
the low tax Chloe of 100 years ago.
The kind of like local paper letters page of like, why is my council tax going to this park type people. So that entailed, among other things, a very interventionist attitude towards things like housing. The Housing of the Working Classes Act was actually introduced partly under the LCC's pressure, so the kind of act that introduced kind of mass council housing into British life. But probably most interesting for the story I'm trying to tell in the book is the Works Department. Mm-hmm. And the Works Department was described at the time by the newspapers, by the Times in particular, as communist, as a kind of example of communism, and was particularly seen, they particularly associated it with the workshops that are set up after the French Revolution of 1848, when kind of these sort of public works organisations were set up under some nominal workers' control. So the Works Department built stuff, built housing, built fire stations, built schools, built bridges, built the Blackwall Tunnel, but it did it paying trade union rates, and did it with a degree of popular control, and did it, of course, circumventing completely the established building industry, who, of course, are and have always been very close to the Conservative Party. And for this, the LCC were dragged through the courts, and after the Tories and their various names took over the council in 1907, it was abolished. But there was very much this experiment of trying to kind of do everything in-house and do everything, through the council. Imagining this kind of future in which, kind of everything in London, from the parks to the water to the trains to the tubes to the housing, would be public. And that, for a thing that for the Liberals to be doing at the time was particularly quite odd. And the Liberal Party at national level were quite sceptical about it. So it's a sort of, many of the people in it would have considered themselves to be socialist. I'm not entirely sure Perry Anderson would consider them so, but I would.
And I listen, this is setting up the Owen Hatherley Perry Anderson beef that I've always wanted. I
have nothing but respect for Peregrine Anderson.
Oh, that is absolutely not the kind of thing that you'd hear in world star hip hop. I want a bit more antagonism here. Thinking about this as an experiment in socialism, and thinking about it within an imperial context, because obviously at the same time all this is going on, London is the centre of the imperial core. It really is. There's this one quote from Will Crookes, I think it is, that you have in the book, and you say that he later ends up being a social imperialist, but early on when he maybe had a little bit of critical faculty left, he said that you talk of a British Empire on which the sun never sets, but I was born in a London alley where the sun never rose. And even though his personal political arc ends up somewhere different, it made me think, is there something profoundly anti-colonial in aspects of London identity? And if so, where does it come from?
I mean, aspect. I mean, in many ways, London at the time was an imperial capital and an imperial kind of, financial and trade centre. Like, it was absolutely the hub of that entire system. And most London workers were working for that system. So I wouldn't want to overstate it. There's definitely, and the trajectory of these people that came into the LCC in the 1890s, the socialists like Will Crooks or John Burns, Ben Tillett, the fact that they all went to the right is not accidental. It's sort of in there from the start. But first, there's sort of 2 points really. One about organisation and one about kind of perception of London as a place. I think at that point, so the London Labour Party's early slogan from the 1910s onwards was "Home Rule for London." So they considered that this is that point happening at the same time as the agitation for home rule in Ireland, and at the same time was obviously then followed by the Easter Rising and the War of Independence, and obviously lots of the people involved had Irish ancestry. So there's kind of idea of home rule of London, not necessarily being independent as such, but having a parliament and completely governing itself. And this kind of goes alongside this kind of idea that I sort of lost my thread a little bit. So there's a kind of there's a line I think from Herbert Morrison about London being treated like a crown colony by the government that turns up in there, and I think that's partly from the way that actually London at that point still didn't have the powers of Manchester or Glasgow or Birmingham in particular. It didn't control its own trams. It didn't control all of its infrastructure. And the government was still quite resistant to that happening, I think partly because they considered the LCC to be a great political threat. So for them, they would see London as being in some way colonially oppressed by the government in Westminster. And one can argue about the degree to which that's an exaggerated way of looking at it. I think that's certainly arguable. Although it's quite surprising that certain of the figures who later, very much become very imperialist, particularly Morrison later on as a foreign secretary, are at this point much more radical in things like, like Morrison was a conscientious objector during the First World War, was said that he couldn't fight because his religion was socialism. That there was always a kind of religious exemption. If you could, like Quakers and so forth, could get out of it. And it was like, well, this is my religion, sir. But there's also a thing about organisation, obviously, that that London obviously has always been a multicultural city. Since the day it was founded by Italians. It's just what it is, and you can see in a lot of organisation in the kind of nascent socialist movement that's very much part of what's going on. And the kind of heart of it, as I sort of describe it in the book, is Battersea. And particularly, the way that the Battersea Council, which was run by the progressives at that point, was very militantly against the Boer War. And later, a lot of the figures involved in it, such as John Archer, who became the first black mayor of a London borough, and his protege, Shapurji Saklavala, who was the first communist MP, who was elected as a communist MP and served 2 terms as a communist MP for Battersea.
I feel a bit like, the Goodness Gracious Me sketch of like Indian, is that whenever I look at him, I go, you know what, it's like, one of the earliest MPs of Carney's both communist and desi. The way in which it fills me with pride.
So you do have these things which actually later don't really become considered part of the London left until the 70s or 80s, are actually happening in the 1910s. And while the book is quite kind of like ambiguous about Herbert Morrison, I do think that the Labour Party, as he kind of knocked it into shape in the 20s and 30s, lost a lot of that.
I mean, there was another aspect of the LCC that you identified that I definitely sort of saw as a like residual knee-jerk instinct within the Labour movement today. And it was this connection between housing provision and moral puritanism. So the LCC estates, you say there's like, no pubs, no music halls, no fun, really. And it's about kind of, and you can kind of see where it comes from. The Labour movement has this relationship to the temperance movement and, all these things about the condition of the working man must be improved by the denial of bodily pleasures, really. And I think that disciplinarian instinct in the Labour movement is here till this day. So you talk to certain left Labour MPs about decriminalising drugs. The way I say is that it's not really decriminalising drugs. It's making them legal for everybody, because de facto they are legal if you're rich enough or if you're white enough. But the minute you bring this up, it's seen as indulgent, middle class, student stuff, really. And do you think that there's a kind of continuity in that way of thinking?
I think there is, but it's a mess. So one of the things that I liked a lot in the book when I was researching the book was on Bermondsey Council in the 20s and 30s, which was very much one of the sort of socialist strongholds at the time. One of the 5 red boroughs, so-called, 4 of which were in South London, the Alfred Salter, who became the MP, gave a speech, on election, on the day before the election, going vote for me, and I will never vote for any war credits, and I will vote for prohibition. So, there's these two things at once of I will completely stand against war and completely stand against, alcohol and mother's ruin. And these are kind of part of the same thing. The kind of stuff that Orwell has a big go at in Road to Wigan of all the vegetarians and sandal wearers and lesbians and whatnot, and that kind of bizarre rant. Actually, the London Labour Party was full of those people. And they stood in, working class areas like Bermondsey and won landslides. But there's a kind of, the sort of early Puritanism of the LCC is quite ugly in a lot of ways. There is a real kind of deserving poor and undeserving poor. The deserving were catered for very well by the LCC. The so-called outcast London at the time were very much not. Pretty much the only thing they ever got built for them was a huge doss house in Deptford, which is still there. So there was really a kind of, and the kind of music hall aspect kind of comes from that. And that kind of comes from an alliance, I think, of sort of middle-class reformers who consider it all very vulgar, and also kind of socially mobile trade unionists for whom this is everything they're trying to get away from. They're trying to get away from, people, being drunk in the pub and, the sort of seedy streets of London type stuff and syphilis. And, this is their kind of thing that they're rising out of in order to be in this kind of garden city world that they imagine and that they try to make places like Bermondsey into. And actually, the funny thing is that's actually quite close to stuff that your kind of Luke Akehurst types nowadays would consider to be lifestyle politics. It's quite closely linked to, vegetarianism and pacifism and anti-imperialism. These are kind of part and parcel of the same thing in a way but they don't map onto today's political allegiances in the way that I think a lot of people would like. You can find people that seem very, very woke on a lot of stuff who will then suddenly be in favor of eugenics. That's 1910s and 20s politics. That's what it's like, unfortunately.
I mean, so thinking about, the categories of deserving and undeserving poor, and I think that one huge category of what's considered undeserving poor is if you're black, brown, poor, and angry about it. In the book, you do talk about Tottenham, you talk about Broadwater Farm. You're in Bermondsey. I'm currently, I live in Tottenham.
Camberwell, actually. I'm Camberwell. I wouldn't be in Bermondsey.
Sorry, not Bermondsey. Sorry, Bermondsey in my brain. You wouldn't be caught in.
Very different places.
Listen, it's people squabbling amongst Southeast London. I'm like, that's a beef that the UN doesn't get involved with. I'm like, you guys sort that out. But thinking about Tottenham, thinking about Broadwater Farm, because there's two sets of riots in 1985 when Cynthia Jarrett was, when she died in a police raid on her home, and 2011 when Mark Duggan was shot and killed by the Met. They're just so formative if you've got roots in this area. And obviously mine are at more of a distance. I didn't grow up on Broadwater Farm, though, I lived in Tottenham and blah, blah, blah. My family knew, Dolly Kiffin and all the rest of it. It's not the same. But I interviewed a grime MC who was born in 85, grew up on Broadwater Farm, and was friends with Mark Duggan at school. They called each other brother. And when he went to prison to visit one of his family members, one of the people that he saw there was Winston Silcott, right? Who was there on another charge, and he was one of the people who was accused of the murder of PC Blakelock. And thinking about the way in which the left itself sanitizes its radical history, you know, we talk about the poll tax, we talk about, you know, the Match Girl strike, or, you know, Poplar. But some riots, 1985, 2011, and also Toxteth and Handsworth, and, you know, the riots which took place outside of London, don't feature in that history of left-wing radicalism. And I suppose I wanted to ask you why you think that is.
I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends on sort of which bit of the left. I think there are certain people on the left for whom rioting is literally the only political expression. Anything else is mere reformism. But I think they are part of the story, and Broadwater Farm in particular, actually, because whereas there's a huge quantity of kind of grievances in 1981 that you can, you know, 1981 is national, you know, that it happens everywhere. It happens, you know, where I grew up, which is not London. But 85 is so localized to that estate and what had happened in that estate, which can be summed up, I think, by the way that it was managed in a fairly racist way, and the way that it was policed in a, I think, quite explicitly racist way. And for that, it's kind of I sort of use it as a way of talking about the way that the New Left and the Labour Party intended to kind of do different things with the welfare state to the previous generations, exemplified by Herbert Morrison's. So, you know, Broadwater Farm notoriously had this sort of community centre, youth club, I think, that was entirely white, a tenants association that was, I think, entirely white, in an estate which was about 50-50. And so you then had, the Broadwater Farm Youth Association, which was set up by, what's his name? He's still around, very much a kind of big thing on. Anyway, get onto that later. The Broadwater Farm Youth Association was very much an attempt to kind of have a community group that could speak for the people of Broadwater Farm that were not spoken for by the officially recognised and entirely white kind of, capital C community. And obviously, lots of the things that association wanted to raise was questions of policing, which was extraordinarily aggressive on Broadwater Farm, obviously culminating in the death of Cynthia Jarrett. And the people that were kind of involved in speaking for that, as well as the people that were involved in the youth association, there was also very much had people in the local council who were, very, very much engaged. So, there's the famous photo that people like to kind of show from 1987 of, your newly elected MPs, where you have Diane Abbott and Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Grant. And because of Grant's early death, he doesn't kind of feature in the story as much as he ought to, because he doesn't have that, he didn't become part of that kind of surreal, second win that they all got in 2015. So yeah, he's a huge part of it. I mean, his sort of is incredibly, to the point of it being quite dangerous, the point he actually had to apologise to the family of PC Keith Blakelock, who was killed in those riots. It was explicitly
got a bloody good hiding.
Got a bloody good hiding. The police got a bloody good hiding. He says that in the speech, and I think people, frankly, enormously appreciated. They enormously appreciated the fact that the council leader at that point, had seen a fight between the youths of Broadwater Farm and the police, and had explicitly taken the side of those youths. And that was the thing that was happening a lot at that point. Like, there's a wonderful anecdote about Ken Livingstone being given the choice, basically in 1981, of like going to the royal wedding or going to the front line in Brixton during the riots, and he does the latter. And while I don't necessarily want to have a go at him because he seems sincere in his way, one could contrast this with David Lammy's reaction to the riots in 2011, of it being essentially criminality.
Well,
And I think that shows a lot of the differences
to attend the vigil, which is the thing I remember the most, is that David Lammy refused to attend the Mark Duggan vigil because he said that he wouldn't want to share a platform with anarchist groups. And I think whatever else, he said, and, he did talk about there being a history of policing in Tottenham and blah, blah, blah. It was fatally undermined by his being afraid of the optics of what it meant to stand with his constituents in that moment.
And that's one of the really striking things about that generation, is that they didn't really give a fuck about that. And you can trace so much of, like, that there's lots of people, where have these people come from? That one of the councillors who was involved in Broadwater Farm and was in the 1980s was Jeremy Corbyn. This history is very, very rooted in those communities.
Well, so, I mean, name drop time. Bernie Grant was a really good mate of my grandma and my mum. So that's what I mean by, like, if you're in Tottenham, everybody knows everybody. And I think when I was maybe about 5, took me and my sister to see the Houses of Parliament, and we were spectacularly unimpressed, apart from there was a thing in the car park which he drove onto, and then it rotated the car like it was a microwave, and we were like, that is elite, amazing. And House of Commons, nothing else was like, whatever. I mean, another thing just about Broadwater Farm, and just to connect it a bit more to architecture, is that, as you know, that in 2011, David Cameron was going around drawing connections between growing up in a big modernist council estate and being more likely to riot, and the way in which in the imagination there are these short circuits between, like, do I see concrete? Okay, the people here are feral.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that was so frustrating about that, I mean, obviously, there's sort of various, but one of them is that those areas by then were safer and better liked than they had ever been. Places like the Aylesbury Estate and Broadwater Farm were actually by then pretty much fine. Broadwater Farm has a far lower crime rate, I think, to this day than the rest of the borough. The waiting list to get a flat on it is enormous. And it's an estate that was, considered hard to let for a very long time. And estates like that now, there's a waiting list as the size of a small town trying to get a flat in them. There really is, and so it just bore no real relation to the reality that was happening on those places by 2011. But also, it said a lot about London geography. So obviously, David Cameron and George Osborne lived in North Kensington. So, in fact, I remember for a time, I think they were called the North Kensington set or the Notting Hill set or something like that kind of particular clique of Tories. And of course, living where they did, like off Portobello Road, they had in one direction Trellick Tower, where, when the flats go on the open market, they go for £1 million. And in the other direction, Grenfell Tower. And yet they had no apparent idea about any of these, about any of this. That the world they lived in was so rarefied that even though they were living next door to a very successful council estate around Trellick Tower, but also B, one where, right to buy flats went for crazy money. But they just, there's a thing that always sticks with me in the aftermath of Grenfell, that I got rung up by someone at the Evening Standard. So the editor obviously being George Osborne, very interested to find that that a lot of the people who lived in the tower and who died in the fire were, architects and artists. Is there anything you'd like to say on that? And I was like, well, the only thing I'd like to say about that is, how does he not know? He lives around there. How would you not know that a tower block now in London will contain loads of people that do, what would otherwise be considered middle-class professions? Like, it's incredibly common, but they live in their own world completely.
I 100% get what you mean, because I remember being at uni, and going to uni was the first time I really interacted with people that went to fee-paying schools and boarding schools and stuff like that. I'd never met people like that before. And I remember being in the common room and just like eavesdropping on people's conversations, which I still do. I love listening to things which aren't my business. and there were some very, very posh hipster girls from the year below, and they were talking about where they were going to move after halls, right? So they were making a decision, and just hearing the way in which they talked about the areas that they were going to live in, the areas which are historically, really working class and, very diverse. And on the one hand, it was like, that's where you go because it's cheap and kind of cool. But on the other hand, it was like, oh, it's so sketchy around there, though. Like Elephant and Castle is properly sketchy. And sketchy was their favourite word. And I was like, what do you think is going to happen? The worst thing that's going to happen to you is you get a bad deal from your ketamine dealer. And love, I think that already happened. But like, do you know what I mean? It's that thing of, on the one hand, like upper class quality of like defining your like coolness by your proximity to these areas, but you tell a story of that area which indicates that you've had no contact with the people living there whatsoever.
Well, yeah, you could sort of imagine maybe that George Osborne was sort of dimly aware of like, the estates around the Westway, but would consider them a bit stabby.
Yeah. I mean, that's also a New Labour like thing. Was it Harriet Harman wearing the stab-proof vest? It's
Harriet Harman, and that was sort of what was worse about that is that she knows better. Like, she's lived around here for 50 years, I think. Has been in touch with like, the community groups on the Aylesbury since the 70s. Like, she could walk through any of those estates, dressed in a t-shirt, and no one would give a fuck. They would go, oh, over there, that's Harriet Harman. So it was purely a display to people from outside, and I expect largely to non-Londoners of like, I am going to the dangerous place, which she knew full well was not dangerous. Whereas I think the kind of girls you're describing, or Gideon Osborne, would probably genuinely think they are dangerous.
Is that proper sketchy? Proper, like, Jesus Christ. So I'm gonna move on to questions from the audience. So keep them coming in. This first one from Alicia. Pretty tall order. So if you've got the answer to this, I am.
Oh God, one of these.
So, question from Alicia: how do we kick back against the normalization of lies, fear, and the narrative of the mainstream media?
If I had a Patreon, I'd be now subscribe to my Patreon. No, I don't know. We had this thing we were doing, and it ended really badly. I don't know. If I knew, I would be doing it. Yeah. I think we're, like, if I'd been asked that question a year ago, I'd have gone, right, well, we're doing this and this and this and this, and this is going to be the future of it, and it's going to go there. And it didn't. It went somewhere else. I suppose lots of the book is trying to argue that get yourself elected as a councillor. This is my advice to the people of London is, get in there and have some fun with it. Because I think it's much more up for grabs than people make out.
But you know what? I do think that, my reading of the last 5 years is we captured the top of the Labour Party by mistake. And that was a whole middle layer, which, maybe that's the way forward. So I've got a question from John. John, who says, what you say about Kensington and Chelsea Council is completely right, but how do you see the record of other more radical and progressive councils, such as Camden and Islington? Is there an unappreciated story about decent, high-quality council estates in the centre of London that still exist and still provide good housing to working-class Londoners?
Yeah, of course. Whether or not I'd say either of those two councils particularly radical right now, I think is debatable. I'm not sure if this is the place to answer that question, but one of the things I think that that kind of period of building council housing en masse that went from the 20s until the early 80s just meant that London and inner London ended up with a huge quantity of genuinely affordable housing that a lot of cities that didn't do that didn't have that programme, and didn't get bombed in the particular places that London got bombed, that don't have this. You don't have this in Paris. You don't get like the equivalent of, Ladbroke Grove having a load of council estates in it in Paris. It's just not there. Obviously there are working class areas of Paris proper, but overwhelmingly the Paris working class lives in places that aren't officially Paris, like Saint-Denis and so forth. So, that legacy has even despite things like right to buy, it has continued. It has provided a lifeline for hundreds of thousands of people. As to what's happening now, I mean, the thing I liked about Islington Council stuff that they've done with housing is they've just renovated a load of stuff. And I think a lot of the time, renovating a load of stuff rather than trying to do something more complicated is a good idea. That a lot of councils, Croydon, which has just gone bankrupt, being a case in point, have tried to kind of build these sort of entrepreneurial states where they will, set up their own kind of building companies and kind of, get involved in the property market and build a bit of council housing on the side and so forth. And that's really, really dangerous. A lot of what Croydon did actually was very good. They built a lot of good housing in the last 10 years. But if you're going to do that by playing the market will beat you. And, this is very much the lesson of Ken Livingstone's second incarnation as mayor as well, is that, you cannot do these things through the market. And Camden at the moment are very much trying to do that through the market. There's a phrase that one of their councillors have said about their recent housing, which is very good housing in and of itself, is that it's their North Sea oil strategy. So they can sell incredibly expensive London housing and sell this incredibly expensive land, and then on the side build a load of council housing. And it's like, well, by the fact that you're then being able to, that rentals can charge so much in the rest of Camden, you're going to put more people on the waiting list and more people in need of housing, which means that you're going to need to build even more housing, which needs even more resources, which means even more land sales. I mean, it's just, like an A-level economics student could tell you it's a bit dodgy.
But it's an ideological marriage to thinking that the market will come up with a solution to problems of public provision.
It is, but I think there's also a lot of it as councillors trying to go, well, what can we actually do? What in this situation are we able to do? And a lot of kind of councils, from those that are kind of broadly on the left to those that are not, thought they could do is kind of, set up these sort of semi-independent companies to build housing, and that they then, have investment from venture capitalists and so on. And that they usually are, that's sort of a way of moving on from the New Labour idea, which was that council housing was shit and should be destroyed, which was very much the idea. They will have no revisionism on. They despised council housing. But, that there was an idea of we should do it, but you couldn't really do it in the old way because the government would crush you. And actually, Theresa May liberalised the law on this a little bit, so it's not quite as difficult as it used to be, but anyway.
So critical and qualified solidarity for Comrade May.
I never thought I'd say it.
Well, that's going to be some angry tweets about that on Left to Right. So we've got a question from Nacho. As the socio-cultural values of England and London keep drifting further and further apart, do you see some kind of independence movement gaining force in the near future?
No, and I think it's important to guard against that. I think there was a lot of that after the referendum of kind of, people going like, yeah, we should totally be independent. I mean, oh God, these awful people. I think what's actually happening, and it's writ large in London, but what's actually happening is urban Britain, well, urban England, urban Wales, actually, come to think of it, and everywhere else. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean, and there's other places people aren't in trouble because they are, but it's a different kind of trouble. And I think that, the politics of London do closely resemble the politics currently of the city of Manchester, of Bristol, of Leeds, of Birmingham, Sheffield. And those are the places where, incidentally, the vote, was pretty much okay, a year ago. Those were the places that were least affected. So it's sort of urban suburban, I think. I wouldn't even say urban towns versus cities. I think that's wrong. I think a lot of places that are claimed to be towns, such as Dudley and Wigan, are actually suburbs of Birmingham and Manchester. And if they were in London, they would be regarded as such.
I mean, do you think that's, the problem isn't too much London centrism? The problem is not enough London centrism. So everyone's just got to make their peace with the fact that you're a town, you're a borough of your nearest city. So Wigan, get over it. You're a borough of Manchester the way Croydon is of London. And if we could accept Croydon, and I did so with a heavy heart as a North Londoner, I accepted Croydon, then Wigan could accept their part of Manchester.
And that's where the kind of things like infrastructure come in. Like, I'm very kind of like, I get quite tetchy about people going, oh, Londoners are so privileged. But one of the places in which London genuinely is privileged is infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Like, that not being from London, when I hear Londoners talk about London transport being bad or unreliable, I am a little bit, have you ever left the M25? That every other big city in the country, pretty much without exception, has transport that is so much worse than London, it's outrageous. There's a couple of places where it's all right. Nottingham is bad. But most, it's really appalling. And places that are like Birmingham and Leeds, that are really quite big cities, have transport that would shame Watford. And that's the real issue. And I think that's also one reason why those places then don't see themselves, why Dudley doesn't see itself as being what it obviously is, which is, the Sutton of Birmingham. But instead sees itself as being a town. It's because, well, it's really fucking hard to get to Birmingham. So I think that's definitely part of it. The fact that, like, when Northern Rail got its, like, swish new trains, they were discarded Thameslink trains. They just discarded for the genuinely quite swish new Thameslink trains that London has. So that's a fairly obvious example.
Big sister with the hand-me-down gums,
Exactly.
I can understand why.
But what people miss, I think, is that the first victims of that system are usually Londoners, in the rent that they have to pay and the hours they have to work, in the homelessness that you see, and in the fact that, it's in London where the tower blocks are burning down.
I mean, so this is a question from Lorcan, which is if comrades wanted to consciously build a new red municipalism in their city, how should they start? What would be their program and organizational base?
I think probably you'd want some combination of kind of housing activism and workplace activism, and the fact that you can still just about, before they expel us all, use the Labour Party to advance those things. So I was talking to a comrade in Bristol not long ago, and he was talking about the way that, the fact that many councillors there are members of Acorn, and that they would turn up to Acorn Action. And the fact that Paul Smith, the recently sadly resigned Director of Housing in Bristol, had been building a lot of very high quality council housing. And so you had this kind of like dual layer thing of like that the council would be involved in activism on one level, and it would be involved in, building new housing. And, that's kind of what you want, I think, is some kind of thing where you can kind of bridge the kind of activist layer and the kind of the local state doing state things like building stuff. And that's the ideal for me, really. And I think it's no accident that the mayor of Bristol, who's not particularly left wing, came out from day one in support of chucking the Colston statue in the harbour. Like, didn't have an eye to what the Times got to think about this, like certain other mayors might, but immediately was like, these are my people and I am supporting them. They should have been done decades ago. And
I mean, I think you see some individuals, there are just people I know personally who are doing that as that kind of campaigning councillor role, but it's very much still individuals, and there's not yet a political vehicle for institutionalizing that process of activist into councillor.
No, there isn't. And I think that was a real failure in the 5 years that we were accidentally still in, but, accidentally in a more prominent role in Labour Party. And that, I think, is there was such focus on like defend leadership, defend Jeremy, win the next election, get through the next hurdle, that there was this kind of huge layer in the middle that just wasn't thought about. So there was like, the kind of us as the kind of foot soldiers of Jeremy, and then Jeremy at the top, who we would occasionally have to kind of go in to save him from things. And the fact that like the Labour Party controls most local authorities in the country just didn't feature. probably the nearest it came to being like a real battle was Haringey.
Mm.
And the record of Haringey is mixed, and I don't think it's entirely bad, but it's certainly mixed. But that was the nearest it ever came to like, right, let's take a council over.
And even then, there were then problems with the first Momentum run councils, so-called, being, they would argue hands being tied by aspects of deals that had already been made, and things like the Latin Village, the market, which is actually just down the road from me, being shut down and traders moved on.
I mean, the thing that they stopped, the Haringey development vehicle, was vastly worse than anything that they're planning now. They've been apocalyptic, but I think that just showed how massively out of their depth they were, because there had been no real training. There had been no kind of like, right, this is how the system works. This is how officers work. This is how property developers work. This is how the mayoralty works. This is how, and things like the people like Corbyn and McDonnell and Abbott came out of in the 80s, like London Labour Briefing. They would tell you things like that. And we didn't. I think partly because people were just so terrified of being expelled or looking disloyal that there was no real kind of sense of just like educating people about what the machine is and how it works. So I think it was naivety rather than anything else on Haringey's part.
I think people would be happy with that assessment. I've got one last...
Be generous.
It's very generous, very kind. That's the kind of gentle politics for you. So I've got one last question. As we're coming towards the end of our evening. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Last question is from Conrad. What opportunities for housing does community wealth building offer? Brackets, shout out to North Ayrshire as well as Preston. And I was like, what's he done? But no, Preston.
North Ayrshire, by me. You know what? I don't actually like. One of the things that's kind of interesting about community wealth building that has been happening in places like Preston and Salford and so on is that they've generally been about places where the local economy is already in quite big trouble. Particularly Preston. Actually, Salford has had a boom of sorts. So the left kind of got to run Preston because no one else had any ideas about what the hell do you do with Preston. Like the right had run it for donkey's years. And, when the financial crash happened and money pulled out of the city, there were literally no plans, no ideas. And so it was, like the old Bennites and the young Bennites in the case of Matthew Brown were allowed to kind of to do their thing. And they've done it enormously successfully. And I salute it. But doing that in a place of a housing crisis is a whole other story. And doing that in a place where like land costs a shit ton of money and where developers are absolutely, kind of swooping around every small site is very, very different. And the pressures are very, very different. So I think the first principle of it that would be useful in looking at housing is always this idea that the thing that I like about the Preston model is it looks at what's happening, what's actually happening, and goes, what here works? So in the case of Preston, it looked at the bus station, it looked at the market, and it looked at the university, and it looked at the hospital, and went, this is Preston's economy. Like it's these things which currently, if you took a policy wonk to, they'd look at it and go, oh God, that's horrible. I remember Preston Market 10 years ago, it was grim. The bus station, was incredibly dilapidated, although it's one of the best buildings in the country. Whereas now they're in wonderful shape. And that's partly because there's been a kind of like what here is already thriving or already could thrive if it was given some encouragement and some resources. And that could then be the basis that we build the economy on. And what a Labour councillor in London would necessarily, if they were to find somewhere like that, they would find it in the Latin Village, they would find it in the Elephant and Castle, and they would find it in those little enclaves that still survived in Rye Lane, in like the small enclaves that survived in London of working class life and of the economies that come along with that. And because of the enormous amount of money you can get from selling land and property in London, that's generally not what councils have done. They've still seen those things as a threat rather than the first step. And I think you could see that you could apply that insight to housing by looking at, things that were you could constantly demonized, like the Aylesbury estate or the Broadwater farm, and going like, how does this work? What are the things that actually make this work? What do people in here want? and what would they do if they had the resources? And that's kind of how that model in theory works. And I think that could be very well used in London if they could resist the temptation to speculate on their land all the time.
I think that seems like a really good place to wrap up. It's got the right notes of optimism and pessimism in there. That, my friend, is true centrism.
That was, I thinking, of dialectics.
Oh no, I was just thinking like, oh yeah, political ambivalence. Let's go. But Owen, thank you so much for.
Thank you.
I mean, thank you so much for writing a book in defense of London. That makes me very happy on a personal, marrow deep level. I'm going to be going around. Anyone's like, you know, and you get that. You get that with lefties in Manchester or Liverpool, and they think they're all that. And I'm going to be like, look at this. Sure, we produced David Cameron and Gideon Osborne, but we have this too. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And I do definitely encourage everyone to get a copy of the book. I thought it was brilliant, and I'm not just saying that.